I've heard a rumor, I think it's fake news, but, and I don't believe it, but I've heard a rumor that some people don't like caterpillars. Not true? But come on, how could you not like that caterpillar? You can't get more beautiful than that. I'm not going to talk about water today, but I am going to talk about the landscapes that impact water. I don't have to tell you people that big lawns and pavement are not watershed managers' friends, but that plants and the plant roots and plant leaf litter are your friends. The question I want to address today is which plants should we focus on when we're trying to restore healthy watersheds? We really have two choices when we're building landscapes. And I'm talking about rebuilding landscapes because we've destroyed most of them already. We want to put it all back together again. So our two choices are to build a landscape that supports the natural world around us or to build ecologically dead landscapes. And for the past century, we've chosen option 2. But the first option is the only one that's going to sustain the human enterprise, and the second one will not. We're just starting to actually recognize that. What most of us haven't recognized is that to restore ecosystem function, to restore the natural world on these restored landscapes, we have to build what nature really is. And it's a series of specialized relationships. And most of those relationships involve insects. So that's actually where I come in. I am an entomologist. So for example, if you want to have that beautiful moth on your property, that is the goldenrod stowaway. It's a misnomer because it has nothing to do with goldenrod. And that is what its beautiful caterpillar looks like. But it is a host plant specialist on Biden's Aristosa. If you're going to have that moth, you've got to have that plant. If you want the acorn weevil, you've got to have acorns. And if you want acorns, you've got to have oak trees. If you want to have pileated woodpeckers, you have to have enough large standing trees to support carpenter ant colonies because it is carpenter ants that they feed their young on. That's what they rear their young on. There are 13 species of native bees in New England that will not be around if you don't have sunflowers because they will only rear their young on the pollen of sunflowers. And you won't have Phlox divaricata, a very common spring ephemeral, if you don't have its pollinator. Now, phlox, of course, spreads readily from seed, but only if it's pollinated. And if you look at the entrance to that corolla there, it's a tiny little hole. Watch native bees land on these flowers and try to get their mouth parts in there, and they can't do it. So who's pollinating our phlox? Well, it's day-flying sphinx moths. Things like the hummingbird sphinx or the snowberry clearwing. They have very long tongues, and they sink them deep into the corolla of those flowers, and when they pull them out, they're covered with pollen. So you can get your phlox pollinated if you have adult snowberry clearwings. You can have adult snowberry clearwings if you have larval snowberry clearwings. And you can have larval snowberry clearwings if you have coral honeysuckle. That is the native honeysuckle. That is their host plant. So we're talking about specialized relationships, particularly the ones that involve insects. They are the rule in the natural world. They are not the exception. And of course, they always start with plants. Now, there are many other animals besides insects that depend on the specialized relationships that insects have with plants. And I'm going to talk about chickadees. This is the Carolina chickadee. That's what we've done a lot of research on. But it's very similar to the black-capped chickadee, the one that you have up here. So we'll just call them chickadees. Most people think chickadees are seed eaters because they are during the winter. They're one of the most common birds that you have at your feeder. But when it comes time to make more chickadees, to reproduce, they're not eating seeds anymore. Baby chickadees can't eat seeds. Most baby birds cannot eat seeds or berries. So they switch to insects, and the insects they like the most are caterpillars. As a matter of fact, if a chickadee is in a healthy environment making lots of caterpillars, they will feed their young exclusively on caterpillars. And it turns out that they are not exceptions. Most birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. And we're starting to realize that it is caterpillars. Out of all the plant eaters in the world, caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other organisms than any other type of herbivore. So let's ask the question, why caterpillars? What is special about caterpillars? And there are a number of things special about caterpillars. And one is that they are soft. So think of this caterpillar as if it's a sausage, little sausage with a very thin wrapper. Now, the thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's cuticle. It's not digestible. A bird doesn't want any exoskeleton. And that means you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it because it is soft. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear its young, they're pretty rough. It really is just like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They are nutritious. They're very high in protein, very high in fat. They have a low percentage of chitin compared to most other types of insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. And they have lots of sharp edges. And it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I'll just mention carotenoids briefly. It's not because I love chemistry, but we are vertebrates. Chickadees are vertebrates, birds are vertebrates. Birds don't make carotenoids. They only come from plants. So the carotenoids that are essential components of our diets have to come from things that eat plants. And it turns out that caterpillars have more carotenoids than any other type of insect by far. So for most birds, caterpillars may not be optional parts of the diet. It's starting to look like they are essential parts of the diet. And that means if you're a breeding bird, you're not going to be successful if you are in a landscape that doesn't have enough caterpillars. Having almost enough caterpillars isn't good enough. You've got to be able to bring your offspring through to independence, and that takes a lot of caterpillars. But that's the next question. How many caterpillars is enough? What does it take to rear a clutch of chickadees? And the answer is it takes lots of caterpillars. And it was these particular birds that taught me that. Years ago, I was interested in what chickadees were feeding their young, so I put a chickadee box in my yard. And I hung it low so I could set my camera up and then take pictures of what they were bringing back to the nest. And that's when I learned they were bringing back caterpillars, but I also learned they were bringing them back very quickly. Both the male and the female are out foraging all the time, so they can bring a caterpillar back to the nest once every 3 minutes. I watched them for 27 minutes at one point, and during that 27 minutes, they brought back 30 caterpillars. How do they do that? By bringing back more than one at a time. And sometimes a whole bunch. And they're doing this all day long, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. All right, the next question is, how many species of caterpillars do they bring back? And this turns out to be an important ecological question. First of all, chickadees and most birds do not forage very far from the nest. For chickadees, it's about 50 meters from the nest. So if you want chickadees in your yard, if you want them in your restored landscape, you have to have what they need within 50 meters of the nest. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to get to the nearest woodlot because that takes far more energy than they would get from whatever they catch there. Well, I watched them for 3 hours one morning, and during that 3 hours, they brought back 17 species of caterpillars that they had found within 50 meters of the nest in my yard. Why is that important? Well, if I had 1 or 2 species of caterpillars in my yard, and it happened to be a bad year for those species, populations fluctuate, and they're spending a lot of time in the bottom trough these days. There wouldn't be nearly enough caterpillars for the chickadees to successfully reproduce. But if I have 17 species, or 34 species, or 134 species, and that actually stimulated me to start counting the species of caterpillars. And I'm talking about just moths. They ignore butterflies for the most part. And I am up to 936 species of caterpillars that I have found in my yard. And I'm still counting. So every time I go out, I find more. It'll probably be around 1,000 species. That's good news because there will always be some combination of all of those different species. So regardless of where they are in their population trends, there will be enough caterpillars to support chickadee reproduction. So this is an example of diversity creating stability in the food web, or diversity creating stability in the ecosystem. You've heard diversity is good. This is a primary reason. I have a diversity of moths on my property because I've got diversity of the plants that create those moths. All right, there was a guy in 1961, Richard Brewer, who was studying chickadees, and I don't know what his major question was, but one of the things he needed to know is how many caterpillars they bring back to the nest every day. And he found it was between 390 and 570 each day, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And they're in the nest for 16 days. Then they fledge, but after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 24 days until they're totally independent. But they're flying all around, so old Richard Brewer couldn't count them after they fledged. So just to the point where they leave the nest, that is 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars required to make one clutch of chickadees that they find within 50 meters of the nest. And chickadees are tiny birds, third of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. What if I wanted to have a red-bellied woodpecker in my yard? It weighs 8 times more than a chickadee. How many caterpillars does that take? And I don't want just chickadees and red-bellied woodpeckers. I want a diversity of birds. I want scarlet tanagers and titmice and blue jays and bluebirds. I want tree swallows and common yellowthroats and indigo bunnings and towhees. I want yellow warblers. I want thrushes. I want wrens. I want cardinals. I want hummingbirds. And I don't want one pair of them. I want breeding populations. If not in my yard, then in my neighborhood. How many caterpillars does that take? A lot. And you might say, well, the hummingbird doesn't need any insects because it eats sugar water. And it does eat sugar water. That's what it's doing right there. But 80 to 90% of a hummingbird's diet is insects and spiders, and then it goes to get the sugar water. You don't make a bird out of sugar. You make it out of protein. And that is true for 96% of the terrestrial birds in North America. They are rearing their young directly or indirectly on insect protein. And when I say indirectly, if they ate a spider, the spider needed an insect to become a spider. And this is news. This is news to a lot of people who think that birds only need seeds and berries. And if we put up our bird feeder, we have given birds everything they need. Well, a lot of birds do eat seeds and berries after they have reproduced. So putting plants in your yard that make seeds and berries, that's a good thing, but you also have to have the plants that make the insects that create the birds that can eat your seeds and berries. So no caterpillars, no baby birds. A bit of a generalization, but not much, not much. All right, how do we do that? What types of landscapes are capable of producing the diversity and the abundance of insects that we're talking about here? Well, now we have to reconsider those specialized relationships I started the talk with. We have to talk about the most common type of specialized relationship that occurs all over the planet, and that is the relationship between the insects that eat plants and the plants themselves. So I'm not talking about pollinators right now. I'm talking about things like this polyphemus moth caterpillar and the oak leaf that it's eating. Remember, plants really don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction, so they have loaded their leaves with nasty-tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And if you don't believe me, in the springtime, go out and eat a leaf. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. All plants are defending themselves with nasty-tasting compounds. There is a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat vegetables. I mean, they inherently know that they are toxic. So this is a wonderful defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green in the summertime. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because the insects that are out there cannot eat most of them. They are too well protected chemically. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are what we call host plant specialists. Over evolutionary time, they focus in on one or two plant lineages that are very similar in the chemical cocktail they're using to defend their tissues. And they develop the adaptations necessary to circumvent those defenses. They develop the physiological mechanisms, the enzymes, the behavioral adaptations, and the life history adaptations that allow them to minimize their exposure to those compounds. But again, it takes a long period of exposure to those plant lineages for all these adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. And I'm going to use the monarch butterfly as an example of a typical host plant specialist, because you probably already know at least half the story of monarch specialization. You probably know that it is a specialist on milkweeds. And you may know that milkweeds are toxic plants. They're loaded with cardiac glycosides. So when you're eating plants this spring, don't eat a milkweed. Or don't eat too much of a milkweed. If you do, it'll stop your heart. That's what cardiac glycosides do. Now, they don't stop the monarch's hearts, and they do have hearts, by the way, because they've got the enzymes that detoxify and store and excrete those cardiac glycosides. All right, that's half the story. The other half involves the sticky latex sap that gives milkweeds its common name. If you break open a milkweed leaf, you get all this white goo that comes out. And if you get it on your finger, you usually wipe it off right away. But if you don't, let it sit there for a minute or so, it'll start to gel. It turns into a chewing gum-like substance, and that is its defensive property. If a caterpillar gets that smeared on its mandibles, it glues its mouth shut, and then it starves to death. Well, here's a caterpillar that eats milkweeds. How does it do that? without gluing its mouth part shut. That, of course, is the monarch caterpillar, monarch butterfly caterpillar. The first thing it will do, and you can watch this in your yard if you plant milkweeds, is crawl to the tip of the end of the leaf, and it starts to eat. And if any latex sap comes out at all, and we see a little bit right there, it'll stop eating immediately, turn around, crawl up the leaf, maybe 2/3 of the way, and it starts to chew through the midrib. And it chews till it has completely severed the midrib. And what it's done is block the flow of latex sap from this end of the leaf to this end of the leaf. And then it can turn around and go back down, and it can eat the leaf without any latex sap coming out at all. Very simple behavioral adaptation, but one that most insects have not figured out how to do. That actually flags the leaf. So if you are a monarch hunter, you can drive down the road, look at a milkweed patch. If you see flagged leaves, you know there are monarchs there. Okay, those are the upsides of specialization. The monarch is able to eat a plant that most other insects cannot eat, and that minimizes its competition. All right, those are the upsides. There are downsides of specialization, though, and that is that that's all they can eat now. By focusing their evolutionary adaptations only on one genus of plants, they have not spent any evolutionary time trying to get around the tannins that are in oak leaves, or the cucurbitaceans in cucurbits, or the cyanide in cherry, or the nicotine in tobaccos. Every plant lineage has some compound protecting it, and monarchs can only deal with one. We have 2,137 native plant genera in North America. And out of all those plant genera, they can only eat one. That is host plant specialization. And it works out just fine for monarchs as long as we keep milkweeds around. But if we take them out of our landscapes, which we have done, we lose the monarchs. If you're waiting for monarchs to start to adapt to corn and soybeans, you've got a long wait. They're going to disappear long before that happens. And of course, as of 2013, there were only 3.6% of the monarchs left east of the Rockies, because of our undeclared war on milkweeds. West of the Rockies this year, in other words, the migrating population of monarchs in California is down 99.9%. We are right on the verge of looking at an extinction event of that population. So very simple. If you want monarchs, you need milkweeds. The important message here is that there is nothing special about monarch specialization. 90% of the insects that eat plants have the same close relationship with the lineages that they are co-evolved with. If we take them out of our landscapes, we lose those insects. By the way, you know why we want to save the monarch? Because they're pretty. That's the truth of it. I mean, if they were an ugly moth, which most of the host specialists are, we would totally ignore them. So thank goodness for the monarch's beauty, because otherwise we would ignore it. All right, we're learning what food webs are comprised of based on all of this host plant specialization, and that gives us a tool to be able to purposely rebuild food webs wherever we want. And all we have to do is understand the components of those food webs. Then we can put them back on our landscapes, and it should work. I'm going to use the white-eyed vireo as an example of how we can actually do this, and I will use that as an example because that is the nest that my wife Cindy found in our landscape. Well, it's been a few years now. In order to rebuild the food web of this bird, I need to understand which caterpillars they're bringing back to the nest. So I have to set up my camera and take pictures of what they're doing. The birds must have known that, so they built their nest very low so I could set up my camera. If I can identify the species of caterpillar, we know a lot about what plants caterpillars eat. Then I know what plant is necessary to make the food that these birds are rearing their young on. So let's do this for a few minutes. This is the blinded sphinx moth. It is a specialist on black cherry. We have a lot of black cherry in our landscape, making blinded sphinx moths so the babies get to eat. This is the chestnut schizura, and despite its common name, it is a specialist on native viburnums. Now in our yard, that is Viburnum dentatum, arrowwood viburnum, and I know that because I planted it. Our yard was mowed for hay when we moved in, so very few plants there. Most of the plants that are there now are ones that we have planted ourselves. So there you go, viburnum making chestnut schizuras, and the babies get to eat again. So this caterpillar with the white stripe is the drab prominent, a specialist on sycamore. I did not plant sycamore, but about 2 years after we moved in, there was a big wind, a derecho, one of the weather events. It blew in sycamore seeds from someplace, and one landed in my cold frame. And it germinated, and I am not very fast at weeding things out, so this year I think it topped 70 feet. I don't have a cold frame anymore, but I have drab prominence, and the babies get to eat. So on and on we go. This is the 8-spotted forester moth, a specialist on native grapes. We have lots of those. The lunate zale, another specialist on black cherry. This is the spicebush swallowtail caterpillar. It's a specialist on spicebush and its close relative sassafras. We have both of those. You might see the phony eye on the prothorax there that is supposed to scare the bird into thinking it's a tree snake. It didn't work this time. This is the tufted bird-dropping moth, another specialist on black cherry. So black cherry is emerging as a really important component of this bird's food web. But these guys are hungry. They need a lot more than that. So let's put some black walnut in the landscape. If we do that, we get the walnut sphinx, the gray-edged bomoloca, the black blotch caesura, the bride. These are all specialists on black walnut, at least at my house. Native maples will give us Paloides inchworms, the green-striped maple worm, the maple bantam dagger moth, and of course many others. This is native elms. That's the American elm. Give us the four-horned sphinx, double-toothed prominent, interrupted dagger moth, and again, many others. Remember, 90% of the insects we need to feed these baby birds will not be in our yard if we don't have the plants that make those baby birds, that make those caterpillars, that make the baby birds. So if you want the mustard sallow, you need witch hazel. If you want the hackberry emperor, you need hackberry. Coculio asteroides needs native asters. The Arcigera flower moth, the brown-hooded owlet need goldenrod. Hog sphinx, Pandora sphinx, abbot sphinx all need Virginia creeper. Redbud leaf roller needs redbud. The gray furcula needs native willows. The turbulent phosphilla needs greenbrier. And the orange-tufted oneida, the yellow-vested moth, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and many, many more won't be there if you don't have oaks. Because oaks are the most powerful plant. Yes, we should all clap for oaks because in 84% of the counties in North America, oaks are the most powerful plant-making bird food and running these food webs. And by the way, I want to remind you, I took all of those pictures in my front yard, not my backyard. We're not going to talk about backyard habitat because that implies everything I'm discussing is so ugly we have to hide it in the backyard. It gives the front yard a free pass to be a dead zone, and I don't know why we want to do that. It also cuts our conservation options in half. We can put the oak tree in the front yard, too. Why do we want all these insects? Well, the birds want them, yes, but we want more than birds. If you look carefully at any terrestrial food web, you will see that insects are an integral component of almost all of them. All spiders, for example, eat insects. Or they eat other spiders that ate insects. And I know a lot of people don't like spiders, but look who does. It is the second most important component of bird food webs. And they're also really valuable predators. If you get rid of the spiders, you get rid of something that's eating our mosquitoes and all those other things. We have a lot of noise somewhere. If we get rid of our insect herbivores, we're going to get rid of our insect predators. And they themselves are important components of food webs, so we don't want to do that. If we lose our insects, in fact, we will lose our frogs, we will lose our toads, we will lose all the amphibians, because they all eat insects. Our lizards eat insects, our bats eat insects, our rodents eat insects. All of these things depend on insects. Why? Because they are really good food. Some studies have shown that pound for pound, there's twice as much protein in insect meat as there is in beef. And they have organs in their abdomen called fat bodies that are loaded with lipids, high energy compounds that allow these little guys to grow quickly, reproduce quickly. And if you are a mouse, that's what you want to do because there's so many things that want to eat you. But it's the same reason larger organisms are eating insects. They're just really good food. The skunk is digging up your yard to get the grubs that are in your yard. All of our squirrels, our chipmunks eat insects. Possums eat a lot of insects. Raccoons eat a lot of insects. And even things we don't think of as insectivores eat a lot of insects. Like red fox, 25% of its diet is insects. Full quarter of its diet. 23% of a black bear's diet is insects. It doesn't matter how big you are, you need insects. And even if you don't eat insects, you need insects. This is a sharp-shinned hawk. It's a bird predator, and you might think, well, I can get rid of all the insects in my neighborhood and still have sharp-shinned hawks. But think about it. If you get rid of all the insects in your neighborhood, you've gotten rid of the birds that this guy eats. So he needs them indirectly. Same with the garter snake. It's not eating a lot of insects as an adult, but it's eating the frogs and toads that ate the insects. Point is, a world without insects is a world without biological diversity. And E.O. Wilson told us decades ago, E.O. Wilson, that a world without biological diversity is a world without humans. Why did he say that? Because insects are the little things that run the world. He wrote a paper in 1987 telling us that if we were to lose our insects, we would lose most of our flowering plants. If we lost our flowering plants, it would drastically change energy flow through terrestrial ecosystems. The food webs that support animals, so mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, would collapse, and all of those organisms would be lost. The biosphere would rot instead of having rapid turnover of nutrients because the insect decomposers would be gone. And humans wouldn't survive those drastic changes. So, in other words, life as we know it depends on insects. Well, this was 1987, and nobody really believed insects were going to disappear. As a matter of fact, we spent a lot more time figuring out how to kill them than we did how to save them. So we ignored Wilson's warnings, and of course now our insects are disappearing. We got a lot of data from Europe, some data from North America. A lot of it is focused on bees. So here's a few stats just from bumblebees. We got 50% of our Midwest native bees have disappeared from their historic range in the last century. There are 4 species of bumblebees that have declined 96% in the last 20 years. So they're not extinct yet, but they are functionally extinct. There are 3 species that are extinct. They're gone. And 25% of our bumblebee species are at risk of extinction. And that's just bumblebees. I think we only have 35 species of bumblebees. But there are 4,000 species of native bees that are similarly declining. And that's why we have headlines like this in the New York Times. Insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, they didn't read E.O. because he told us what it means for the rest of life on Earth. The Times covered stories about global insect declines 3 times in 2018, and that is good news because there is no way we humans are going to address this problem if we don't even recognize that it exists. Insects have been declining for a long time, as everything else has, but now it's in the public's attention, so that is good. And we're getting a series of headlines, rapid fire here. The UN says we're going to lose 1 million species in the next 20 years, perhaps. And most of those species are insects, in fact. And they get it now. Humans will suffer as a result. So these headlines are scaring people. What I don't like about these articles, if you read them, is that they present it as if it is inevitable. As if, like climate change, nothing we can do about it. There's plenty we can do about it, and we're gonna talk about that. First, we have to understand what the causes of insect decline are. There are a number of them. The misuse and overuse of pesticides, habitat loss, we always throw that in, whatever that means, but when you pave something over, it's not good habitat afterwards. The profligate use of plants that don't support insects. So that's our non-native ornamentals that then escape from our gardens and become invasive plants. Security lights are killing lots of insects every night long. And then, of course, we have climate change. But again, this is good news. We can pull climate change out of there and address those top several causes very easily. Now, I'm a professor. I make assignments. So I'm going to make an assignment. I want each of you on all the land that you manage, even if it's just your home, to turn around insect declines by addressing those top 5 things there. I'm not going to assign climate change yet. We're going to change climate change by policy change. So I'll assign it. Vote. Vote early and often, as Al Capone says. That's how we're going to address climate change. Okay, what's happening to all the things that depend on insects, our insectivores? In most cases, we're not measuring that, but we do measure what happens to birds because people like birds. And then we get the third of the big blockbuster headlines in recent weeks, and that is the loss of 3 billion birds, breeding birds, fewer birds than we had just 45 years ago. You know, a million seconds is 12 days, and I haven't actually calculated this, but I heard that a billion seconds is 31.7 years. It's a lot. It's a lot. Now we have 3 billion fewer breeding birds. And because you, as an audience, are so young, you're all younger than 45, that means none of you were around when we had 3 billion more breeding birds around, which means when you go outside and it's quiet, you think it's normal. That is shifting baseline. That is the problem, and that we don't recognize these problems because whatever we were born with, we think is normal. To not have these birds around is not normal. We've got 432 species of North American birds now at risk of extinction. Not because there's only 5 left of each one, but because their populations are declining so precipitously. And I hear people say, we've got to slow the rate of decline. No, we've got to stop the rate of decline. We got to have them increase again. And we can't afford to lose these things. That's the other part about these headlines that bothers me. They present it as if it's inevitable and it's okay. It's not okay. We cannot tolerate the loss of 1 million species or any of these species. So we really have to, what we have to do is find a way to live in ecological harmony with the natural world that sustains us, to live sustainably with the natural world that sustains us. I do not see any other option. So we have to understand the causes of all of this biodiversity loss, and there's some very general ones. And one is that the parks and preserves that we have, the natural areas that we have, are not large enough to sustain them, and they are too isolated from each other. And I recognize that that is a hard sell up here in Vermont. But believe me, the rest of the country doesn't look like Vermont. When you take a large area like this and you shrink it down to a small area like this, and this is an exaggeration, you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small populations. And that is the major problem, because small populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why? Because all populations fluctuate. In good times they go up, bad times they go down. The top line there is a large population. Even in its down cycle, there's enough individuals so it can increase quickly when times get better. But the small population on the bottom there, in those normal cycles, often hit zero. It blinks out of its little habitat fragment, and then it's gone. And if it doesn't recolonize that fragment, it is permanently gone, and that is local extinction. Don't think about global extinction as the problem. It's local extinction because ecosystems function locally. If there are fewer species in the landscapes you are managing now than there used to be, you have a degraded ecosystem, because ecosystem function is directly correlated with the number of species in it. Every time we take one away, it functions more poorly. And studies from all over the world, and for a long time, 100 years old here, are telling us the same thing. The natural areas we have left on planet Earth are not large enough to sustain the nature that we humans need them to sustain. And unfortunately, that includes our largest national parks. David Quammen has a great analogy between Persian rugs and ecosystems. That is a functional Persian rug. This is not 60 Persian rugs. It's fragments that aren't doing much. And of course, that's what we've done to our ecosystems. So it seems kind of hopeless, but who's in between all those fragments? That's where we are. It's where we live. It's where we work. It's where we farm. We control those landscapes. We can actually fill in those blanks to a greater or lesser extent by choosing the right plants. Now, I've learned that people have a limited ability to absorb bad news. I call it your bad news cup, and when it's filled up, that's it, you turn off. You may have come here with your bad news cup filled up, I don't know. But we have one more piece of bad news we have to talk about, and that is invasive plants. All plants are not equal. We have more than 3,300 species of plants from someplace else, typically China, that are aggressively displacing native plants. Aggressively displacing the native plants that have co-evolved relationships with everything around them. That's the definition of an invasive plant. When that happens, this is what our natural areas look like. This is White Clay Creek State Park. I drive by it on the way to work. When I go to work at the University of Delaware, which is not too often these days. I took this picture in March just to illustrate that plants from Asia leaf out before plants from North America. And I'm sure that's true with your buckthorn and all the other things up here. And it's a great time to look at your natural areas and look at the alien plant load. So every bit of green you're seeing there is a plant from someplace else. It's multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and miscanthus and barberry and privet and autumn olive and porcelain berry and Callery pear and Norway maple and ailanthus and all the other things we brought in as ornamentals that have now escaped and are serious invasives in our natural areas. 86% of our woody invasive plants are escapees from our garden. So we don't have to wonder where these things come from. And about a third of the vegetation in so many of our natural areas are now non-functional plants. They are not able to support the insects that drive our food webs because they haven't been here long enough for those co-evolved relationships to occur. Let me just give you a little bit of data because we actually do measure things in my lab. Very simple experiment. What happens when you take away native plant communities and replace them with non-native plant communities to those insects that are driving our food webs? So not long ago, I grabbed an undergraduate. We went into hedgerows in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware that were invaded with non-native plants. So here's one heavily invaded with autumn olive and a bunch of other things. And we compared caterpillar communities measured in a standardized way in those hedgerows with caterpillar communities in hedgerows that are not invaded. And we found a 68% reduction in the number of species of caterpillars, a 91% reduction in the abundance of those caterpillars, and a 96% reduction in the biomass of those caterpillars, the actual amount of energy in that food web. In other words, we've taken away 96% of the bird food when we allow these plant invasions to occur. Does it matter? Does it matter to this poor common yellowthroat who's trying to feed the babies in his nest? Well, some people have argued that, okay, you took away all that bird food, but he can forage 96% harder and make up for it. No, he can't. He's already foraging all day long, 156 trips a day, 1 trip every 5 minutes. He can't do that 96% higher. So the prediction is you will have 96% less bird biomass in these invaded areas. And that's pretty much what we're seeing with all of these bird declines. What if I told you introduced plants have reduced your bank account by 96%? You would get it, that that's not good. That's a don't kid me, I know you would get it. Well, insects are the currency in our ecological bank accounts. And that's the message that is not part of our culture. It is our ecological bank accounts that are keeping us alive. We cannot afford to lose these integral parts of the ecosystems that support us. So finally, which plants should we be sure to have in our managed watersheds? Well, we've been studying the plants that are most productive in supporting caterpillars, that are most important in driving these food webs, and it turns out, no matter where you go in the country, there are really very few native plants making most of the food. About 5% of our native plants are making about 75% of the food that drives these food webs. So I started calling those plants keystone species. Remember the Roman arch with the keystone in the middle? You take the keystone out, the arch collapses. If you take these plants out of your landscape, the food web collapses. So the message here is it's a nuance on the old message. The old message is native plants are better than non-native plants. Still true, but there are a lot of native plants that aren't all that productive too. Some are much better than others, and we want to focus on the ones that are the best. So the question really is no longer are natives better than non-natives. It's do we want ecologically productive plants in our landscapes or not? I get emails pretty regularly from people reminding me that ginkgo biloba, common street tree we plant it all the time from Asia, well, it grew in North America 7 million years ago. So they say that makes it a native, and that means I can plant it. I don't care if it grew on the moon 7 million years ago. The metric is how many caterpillars is it making, and it makes 0. So forget the native, non-native, just how productive is it? If you really want to support the life around you, ginkgo is not the way to go. So in your county up here, what is it, Chittenden? I can't even say it. Willows support 412 species of caterpillars, vital parts of our ecosystem. By the way, great at managing watersheds. Oaks support 392 species of caterpillars, compared to the 0 on ginkgo. Which are you going to choose? Native prunus, usually number 2 in these rankings from around the country, 388 species of caterpillars in your county. Compared to zelkova, very common street tree again from Asia. I think we planted because it looks like the American elms we lost to Dutch elm disease. That's what they always look like. They're always perfect. They support 0 caterpillars. So if your goal is to put a plant in your landscape that interacts with nothing, zelkova is for you. But I suggest planting a plastic one or a silk one. It'll be just as productive, and you'll never have to water it or worry about it. Pieris japonica. This illustrates that point I'm trying to make. We have native Pieris, but it's a very unproductive genus. Only 2 species of caterpillars eat native Pieris. I don't think there's anything on Pieris japonica. We could have planted blueberries, support 273 species of caterpillars. Native viburnums, 107 species. English ivy supports nothing. Crepe myrtles support nothing. Burning bush supports nothing. All of these things that we've allowed to infiltrate our natural systems are not supporting the caterpillars that we need to drive our ecosystems. So where do you find out what the keystone species for your county is? I notice most of you are not from Vermont. Wherever you go, you live in a county, and you can go to Native Plant Finder on National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of woody and herbaceous plants that are best at supporting your local food web will pop up for your county. I'm trying to convince people to think of the plants in our landscapes, whether it's where we live, our corporate landscapes, all those landscapes that we are managing. Think of those plants as if they are bird feeders, because they are. They could be if we pick the right plants. So there you go, they're bird feeders. Now we get to decide how well we're going to feed the birds. We can feed them a lot, or we can feed them just a little bit. This is what the landscapes around me look like. Giant lawns. 92% of the area around me is lawn, and almost no plants in them at all. If you choose the right plants, you can have food in your bird feeders, and those are those caterpillars, or you can have your bird feeders empty. That big feeder in the back there is the ginkgo. It's a big tree, but it's not making any food. And we're not fooling the birds when we landscape without this notion of keystone plants. I'm going to share a little bit of data from my recent PhD student, Desiree Narango, who studied chickadee reproduction inside the beltway of Washington, D.C., right in the suburbs of D.C. She looked at how successfully these chickadees were able to reproduce in relation to the plants in the surrounding landscape. So you're looking at one of the territories of the birds that she studied. The star is where the nest was. That red line represents the foraging territory. 95% of the foraging occurred within that red line, and 95% of the foraging occurred on the blue areas, the trees that those blue areas represent. And they were all the native trees in that landscape. Basswood, sweet gum, American elm, black cherry, 2 species of oaks. But let's also look at the other trees in that landscape that the chickadees did not forage on, and they're all the trees from Asia. So Japanese maples and silk trees, there's our friend the ginkgo and black poplar, saucer magnolia. And it's very easy to picture a landscape where those are the dominant trees. And when that happens, you can compare chickadee reproduction with landscapes where natives are dominating, and that's one of the things that Desiree did. She found that when you have a landscape dominated with non-natives, they were 75% less likely, or they had 75% fewer caterpillars than the landscapes dominated by natives. So right away, you've reduced the amount of food for the chickadees by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So the chickadees came, there's a nest box up there, but they looked at the landscape and said, there's not enough food here, we're not even going to try. If they did try, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those nests were 29% less likely to survive at all. They produced 1.2 fewer fledglings if they did survive, and they did it slower, 1.5 days slower. And you might say, well, those differences don't look huge, but when you put it all together in a population growth model, this is what it looks like. As a percentage of the non-native plants in the landscape, biomass of the non-native plants. That dotted line right there is replacement rate. That is the rate at which the population has to produce new chicks to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live very long. So if you reproduce at that rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking. Anything above the blue line over here is a growing, or above that dotted line is a growing population, but anything below the dotted line is a shrinking population, an unsustainable population. The intersection here, right here, is around 30% non-native plants. When you have 30% or fewer non-native plants biomass in your landscape, you can have a sustainable chickadee population. But if you have more than 30%, so if you have less than 70% native plants in your landscape, you've got a declining and unsustainable population. The percentage of non-native plants, the average percentage in Desiree's populations were about 56% non-natives. Where I live, it's 79% non-natives, and those are typical throughout the country. So this is good news. This is the first time this has been measured for any bird anywhere. So now we actually have a connection showing that the plants you choose to restore or landscape your landscapes with do impact all the things that want to live there. But it also suggests we have an opportunity for compromise. You know, I looked up compromise in the dictionary the other day. It's not there anymore. We can put it back right here, because this suggests you can have some non-native plants as long as it's not more than 30% of the plant biomass. And that's great news, because if I stood up here and said you are not allowed to have any non-natives in your landscape, that would be the last invitation I get. And, because, you know, we love our beautiful plants, and I get that. She also looked at the migrating birds that stopped by her study sites. This was a 3-year study. 51 species of birds rested in her study sites. Now, migrants fly all night long. If they have a tailwind, they can fly up to 300 miles in a single night. And when they come down to rest during the day, what they're really doing is gassing up. They come down to eat. They've got to restore 35 to 50% of their body weight by eating insects, primarily caterpillars. And if they come down in the land of ginkgo, they're out of luck. Because there's nothing to eat, and that can be the end of their migration. So a lot of people say, I don't have a population big enough to support a breeding bird, and that might be true, but if you have a landscape big enough to support one tree, and you make it the right tree, you can support migrating birds. So what we need to do is rebuild the Earth's carrying capacity, its ability to support life, and we do that by putting the plants back. Where are we going to do that? We're going to do it on private property. 85.6% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. We do have our parks and our preserves, but they are too small, they're too isolated. They are not going to sustain the biodiversity that is out there forever. So we need to help them out. And that means we need to raise the bar about what we ask our landscapes to do. In the past, we asked them to be pretty, only. We're still going to do that. They're going to be pretty. But now they also have to support life. We've got to rebuild those food webs, just like I described. They've got to sequester carbon for obvious reasons. What's doing that, by the way? It's our plants. I had a student a few years ago that said, we need to invent a machine that pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and fixes it and pumps it into the ground. And I said, well, that's good, but we have trees. That's what they do. Got to use them, though. You got to use them. And of course, clean and manage our watersheds. That's what you people do. It's plants that are doing that. If you put the plants back, enrich our soil with carbon. You know, I read somewhere that our soils can sequester 7 times the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere right now. Just got to get it into the soil, and it's plants that are going to do that. And we have to support pollinators. And if I said, why do we have to support pollinators? You would tell me that we have to support pollinators because they pollinate 1/3 of our crops. Which isn't even true. It's about a seventh of our crops with the unhealthy diets that we eat. It's a really anthropocentric view of why we need pollinators. They pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. Has nothing to do with agriculture. It's not an option to lose our plants like that. So we are not talking about good land stewardship to support pollinators. We're talking about essential land stewardship. These are things we absolutely have to do. We have to stop looking at plants as if they are only decorations. That's what we've done for the last century. We go to the nursery, you find something that's pretty, maybe it could be a screen or an anchor or a focal point. But when we choose plants based only on aesthetics, then landscaping equals ecological destruction. That's a pretty landscape, but it is not a functioning ecosystem. We could pick plants that are pretty, but create ecosystem services everywhere, not just in our parks and our preserves, but everywhere. Support those food webs, protect our watersheds, store carbon, create healthy pollinator communities, healthy natural enemy communities, all those things that we have to start doing everywhere. And when we choose plants based on, at least partially on ecological function, then landscaping equals ecological restoration. And I'm going to call this 21st century landscaping. We've done 20th century landscaping, and that hasn't worked. We're now in the 6th grade extinction. So let's try 20th century landscaping and see how it works. Remember, it is not the presence of introduced plants that destroys ecosystems. It is the absence of native plants that destroys ecosystems. And I just got the sign. I've got 2 minutes. All right, there's 8 things that we want to do to restore ecosystem functions in our landscapes. So I'm going to go through them very quickly. One is to reduce the amount of lawn that we have. We have an area of lawn the size of New England. Right now, it's 45.6 million acres. We're still adding 500 square miles to the area of lawn in the U.S. every year. And those are ecological dead zones. I drove by this church in Mississippi not too long ago. Everybody's inside worshiping God's creations, and on the outside they're killing them all because we're not thinking. You know, if we replant half the area in lawn, we can create a new national park that'll be 20 million acres in size, and it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badland National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those, still less than 20 million acres, so that's what we have to do. We want to remove those invasive species from our property. Get rid of your buckthorn and all those other things, and don't go to the nursery and buy another invasive species. If everybody did that, remember, we're 85% done. We want to use Keystone plants. Here's a list of the Keystone plants in your area. You're going to have to go to the website and look it up, but oaks, prunus, salix, they're all very, very powerful plants. Preserve your leaf litter. You know what? I'm just going to blow through this. A lot of the caterpillars fall off the trees in order to complete their life cycle, and we don't landscape under the trees in a way that would permit them to do that. So we want to build diverse landscapes under our trees, not that mowed compact soil. This is where you do your spring ephemeral gardening. Anywhere where you're not mowing and walking, that's what will help those caterpillars complete their life cycle. Put motion sensors on your security lights so they only turn on when the bad man comes. Security lights are killing insects all night long. It's a habit that we have. It really has not much to do with security. Oppose mosquito spraying. Mosquito Joe is going around the country killing all the insects that we're trying to support. When he tells you that it only kills mosquitoes, fake news. It's killing all those insects. When he says it's a natural product, so it's okay, it is a natural product. It's pyrethrins, but cyanide is a natural product too, and it still kills the insects. You can control mosquitoes using mosquito dunks in buckets of water with some hay or straw. You control mosquitoes in the larval stage. Minimize insecticide use. Homeowners use more insecticide at home than agriculture, and everything except for termite control is absolutely unnecessary. So try to reduce your entomophobia. And finally, there's HOA rules. Your homeowners association says, oh, you're not allowed to do this. You have to follow all these strict rules. Join your HOA. Infiltrate. Change from within. Because those are outdated rules. They were made in the 70s when we all wanted to be high status. And now we know a lot more about ecology. We can fix that. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to end. I got to talk about E.O. Wilson one more time. He writes a book a year. He just turned 90, still writing a book a year. In 2016, he wrote Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. Has anybody read Half Earth? It's usually one person, yeah. He says we have to save ecosystem function on half of planet Earth. How is that possible, EO? Half the planet Earth is agriculture right now, and all of us and our infrastructure is stuffed into the other half. I think it is possible. We can realize EO's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation. In the past, we've had humans here, conservation someplace else. Humans here, nature someplace else. That's not going to work. There is no someplace else anymore. Now we have to have conservation and nature and humans all in the same place. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that terminology because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. All places have ecological significance. Here comes the hook. Even your yard. We can't leave conservation to the conservationists anymore. There's not enough of them. Everybody is now a conservationist. One more point here. Roy Dennis is a land manager in England, and he says that land ownership is more than a privilege, it's a responsibility. We have chopped up the biosphere that contains all the life we know of in the universe into private land ownership. Well, now we have the responsibility as landowners of being stewards of all the life in the universe. I can't think of a more vital responsibility than that. All right. Thank you.